The mountain was alive with the sound of wind that cut through the tall pines, carrying with it cold that made every breath sting. Snow lay thick across the landscape, blanketing the roads, the trees, and the small cabins that clung to the mountainside. It was one of those winters that seemed endless, where every day the world looked the same under a heavy gray sky. In a modest cabin on the edge of a ridge, a widow lived with her 2 young children. Their lives had already been touched by loss, and yet, despite the hardship, they carried on with quiet determination. The widow had learned to balance work, home, and her children's needs with a grace born from necessity. She woke early, tending the small wood stove, preparing simple meals, and making sure the house was warm and safe from the cold outside. The children, though young, understood the rhythm of survival in the mountains. They helped where they could, fetching water, stacking wood, and keeping each other company while their mother worked. That afternoon, the snowstorm outside showed no signs of relenting. The wind whipped the snow into sharp little storms of its own, and the visibility was almost nothing. Still, the children were drawn outside, as children often are, to the thrill of snow that came above their knees and glistened like crystals in the pale light. They laughed as they ran, leaving small footprints that quickly disappeared under the shifting snow. They built small forts and tried to make shapes in the snow, their joy piercing the cold and grayness of the day. They did not notice at first the figure that emerged from the swirling white, moving slowly and unsteadily through the drifts. At first, they thought it might be a neighbor or a hunter. People in the town sometimes traveled through the mountains even during storms when it was necessary. But as the figure came closer, the children realized it was a man, tall and thin under layers of wet, snow-soaked clothing. He moved slowly, each step a struggle, leaving a trail in the snow that showed how exhausted he was. His head was down, his arms shaking, and his face was barely visible under a frost-bitten beard and frozen hair. Panic and concern hit the children at once. This was someone in danger, someone who might not survive the storm if left alone. The older child shouted to get their mother, but their voice was muffled by the wind. The younger one, clinging to the older sibling's arm, felt fear but also knew that something had to be done. Together they ran back to the cabin, their boots slipping in the snow, hearts pounding as the wind tore at their faces. Inside, their mother noticed immediately the urgency in their movements and the way their eyes were wide with worry. Without hesitation, she grabbed blankets, a kettle for hot water, and motioned for the children to stay back as she ran toward the figure. By the time she reached the man, he was barely moving. The snow around him was packed and icy, evidence that he had been lying there for some time trying to make his way to safety. He looked up with weary eyes, struggling to speak, but the wind took his words before they could reach her ears. She wrapped the blankets around him carefully, making sure to cover his head and shoulders, and guided him toward the cabin. The children followed closely, still shivering but too worried to complain about the cold. When they finally reached the warmth of the cabin, the mother set him near the stove and started tending to him with a calm efficiency that came from years of managing a household and caring for her children. The man was shivering violently, his teeth chattering and his lips blue from the cold. She boiled water for tea and prepared a simple meal, knowing that he needed warmth and nourishment more than anything else. She tried to coax him to drink, but he could only manage a sip at a time. His hands were numb and stiff, and his body shook uncontrollably. The children watched from the corner of the room, a mixture of fear and fascination in their eyes. They had never seen anyone in such a state before, and it made them realize just how fragile life could be, especially in the unforgiving mountains. As the fire crackled and the snowstorm raged outside, the widow spoke softly to him, asking questions he could barely answer. He managed to give his name and explained that he had been stranded while traveling through the mountains to gather supplies for a distant village. He had gotten lost in the storm and his strength was nearly gone. Though his words were few, there was a quiet dignity in him that made the widow pause. This was a man who had survived hardship before, someone who had endured life in ways she could not fully imagine. She felt a strange sense of respect and curiosity, tempered by the need to care for him in his vulnerable state. The children slowly approached, drawn by a mixture of concern and fascination. They offered him a blanket each and tried to make him comfortable. The man smiled faintly, a tired but genuine gesture, and reached out to let them help. There was a bond forming, unspoken and fragile, between these strangers brought together by circumstance. The widow watched the interaction quietly, feeling a flicker of hope and warmth that she had not felt in a long time. For the first time in months, the cabin seemed to breathe with life beyond the routine of survival. That night, as the storm continued outside, the man slept by the fire, while the family kept a careful watch. The children lay in their beds but listened intently for any sound, afraid he might not wake in the morning. The widow stayed near the stove, tending the fire and occasionally checking on him. There was a sense of fragile peace in the cabin, a momentary respite from the harshness of the world outside. The storm could rage all it wanted, but inside there was warmth, care, and the quiet understanding that sometimes life brought strangers together in ways that were meant to change everything. As hours passed, the man's breathing slowed and the shivering subsided. The widow prepared more food and brought him another cup of hot tea. He accepted it quietly, nodding in appreciation. He could not yet speak much, but his eyes, bright with the reflection of the fire, showed gratitude and a kind of awe. He had survived the storm, thanks to the quick thinking and bravery of this small family who had welcomed him without hesitation. The children watched him, wide-eyed, sensing that he was more than just a visitor. He was someone important, though they could not yet understand why. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the snow-covered windows, the storm had begun to ease. The wind still howled and the snow still fell, but there was a quiet sense that the worst had passed. The man sat up slowly, testing his limbs and feeling the warmth returning to his body. He looked around the cabin at the family who had saved him and realized the depth of what had happened. He had come to the mountains alone, unprepared for the storm, and yet here he was, alive because of their courage and kindness. The widow noticed him stirring and smiled gently, offering more food. She did not yet know who he was beyond his immediate story, but she felt a connection, a sense of trust that could only come from shared experience in the face of danger. The children, still sleepy-eyed but eager, brought him small gifts they had made, a carved figure, a simple drawing, and a knitted scarf. The man accepted each one with careful hands, touched by their innocence and generosity. In that moment, the cabin seemed to glow with something beyond the firelight. It was more than warmth. It was the beginning of a bond that none of them could have anticipated. Outside, the storm had left the world transformed. Snow blanketed every surface, creating a pristine white landscape. The man looked out the window, taking in the mountains, the trees, and the small path that led to the town. He realized that his journey had taken an unexpected turn, one that would change his life in ways he could not yet see. Inside, the family moved quietly, preparing breakfast and tending the small home. The sense of normalcy returned, but it was tinged with the awareness that their lives had shifted forever. They had rescued a man from the snowstorm, and in doing so, they had opened the door to a future none of them had imagined. As the day began, the man sat by the window wrapped in blankets, feeling the warmth of the cabin and the quiet strength of the family around him. He could not speak much yet, but he could feel something stirring inside, a sense of belonging, of safety, and of possibility. The children watched him curiously, sensing that he was more than a visitor. He was someone who might become an important part of their lives. The widow moved around the cabin, tending to chores but glancing at him often, aware of the connection forming quietly, like the slow melting of ice. The snowstorm had brought them together, and the first part of a story that would change all their lives had begun in that small, warm cabin in the mountains. Morning came slowly in the cabin. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving a thick white blanket across the mountains. The sky was pale and gray, but there was a quiet beauty to the world outside the small windows. The man, still wrapped in blankets, moved slowly, testing his limbs and feeling the warmth return to his body. He had survived the night, and with that survival came a strange mix of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty. He looked around at the small cabin, at the widow and her children, and realized just how lucky he had been to find them. The widow moved with calm efficiency, preparing breakfast over the fire. She placed bowls of porridge in front of the children and the man, speaking in gentle tones to encourage him to eat. His appetite was small, but he managed a few spoonfuls, savoring the warmth of the food as much as the taste. The children sat close, watching him with curiosity and concern. They asked questions, simple ones about where he had come from and what had happened, and he answered in small fragments, careful with his words and energy. His voice was quiet, deep, and steady, though it carried a weight that spoke of a hard life and many struggles. Over the next hours, the widow helped him wash the snow and ice from his clothes and body. She worked with efficiency and care, knowing the dangers of frostbite and hypothermia. The man accepted her help with quiet gratitude, nodding and murmuring thanks. He was used to surviving alone, and this dependence on another human felt strange but welcome. The children stayed nearby, watching intently, fascinated by the process and relieved to see him recovering. They had never met anyone quite like him, someone so strong yet so vulnerable at the same time. Once he was warmed and fed, he began to tell small parts of his story. He had grown up in the mountains far from towns and roads, learning to live off the land and to endure the harshness of nature. He had traveled through forests, over ridges, and across frozen streams, always relying on his skills to survive. But even someone with experience could be caught unprepared by a storm as severe as this one. He spoke quietly, carefully choosing his words, and the widow listened with attention. The children were captivated, imagining the forests and mountains, the frozen rivers, and the dangers that the man had faced. As the day passed, the man began to regain some strength. He moved slowly around the cabin, helping with small chores, stacking firewood, and checking on the stove. The children followed him, imitating his movements and asking questions. He taught them small skills, like how to start a fire safely and how to recognize signs of changing weather outside. There was a quiet joy in these lessons, a connection forming that went beyond simple gratitude or curiosity. The widow noticed it too, the way her children looked at him with admiration and trust, and the way he interacted with them gently, with patience and care. By evening, a sense of routine had begun to settle over the cabin. The storm outside had left the mountains beautiful but still dangerous, and the man seemed content to stay, if only temporarily, with the family who had rescued him. They shared stories over a simple meal, the children laughing at small anecdotes, the widow listening with quiet satisfaction as he spoke about surviving alone and finding beauty in places others might consider harsh. There was a sense of understanding, a feeling that they were all part of something larger than themselves, connected by circumstance and kindness. Night fell, and the cabin glowed warmly with the firelight. The man sat near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, while the widow and children tidied the space and prepared for sleep. He looked at the family, feeling a mixture of gratitude and something he could not yet name. He had come into their lives in a moment of danger, and now, safe and warm, he realized that their presence had given him more than survival. They had given him comfort, trust, and a sense of belonging. The children, excited by the day's events, asked questions about the mountains and the forests, about what it was like to survive alone. The man answered carefully, telling them stories that were both thrilling and educational. He described frozen rivers and hidden paths, the ways animals survived the winter, and the importance of paying attention to the smallest details in the environment. The children listened eagerly, absorbing every word, and in return they shared stories of their lives in the cabin, of small adventures and daily routines. There was laughter and curiosity, and in the midst of it a bond was forming that felt natural and unforced. The widow observed quietly, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had saved a life, and in doing so had invited someone new into her home. She wondered about the man's past, about the hardships he had endured, and whether he would remain part of their lives. But as she watched him interact with her children, teaching them, laughing with them, and caring for them, she felt hope stirring, a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Throughout the night, the man sat by the fire, reflecting on the events that had brought him here. He had lived a life of solitude, enduring the cold and isolation of the mountains. But now, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and care, he felt a sense of connection he had never known. The children slept peacefully, exhausted by the excitement of the day, and the widow rested nearby, aware of the fragility of their new reality but also of its potential. By the next morning, the man was stronger. He could walk without support, his movements more confident, his voice steadier. The widow noticed a change in him, a quiet resilience mixed with gentleness. The children ran to him, excited to share their plans for the day and to learn more from him. The cabin was alive with activity, the air filled with warmth, laughter, and the sound of small hands busy with chores and lessons. Outside, the world was still cold and covered in snow, but inside the cabin there was life, connection, and hope. The man realized that his journey had taken an unexpected turn. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had become an opportunity for human connection, for trust, and for belonging. The widow and her children had saved his life, and in doing so, had opened a door to a future that neither he nor they could have predicted. As the day progressed, he began to help more actively. He cleared paths in the snow, gathered firewood, and assisted with chores that required strength and endurance. The children watched closely, imitating his actions, learning and growing in confidence. There was a rhythm to their day, a sense of purpose and a feeling of security that had been missing before. The widow felt a sense of relief, knowing that they had someone capable and reliable in the cabin with them. She also felt a quiet curiosity, wondering about the man's past, his life in the mountains, and what had led him to be caught in the storm. Evening came again, and the family gathered around the fire. The man shared more stories, teaching the children about survival, nature, and the importance of observation and patience. The children asked questions eagerly, sometimes interrupting with excitement, and he answered with patience and care. The widow listened, appreciating the way he engaged with her children, the way he combined knowledge with warmth, and the way he had become part of their lives in just a few days. As night fell, the man sat quietly, reflecting on the changes in his life. He had survived the storm, found safety, and discovered a family that had welcomed him without hesitation. The bond between him and the children was growing, and the widow's presence added a layer of comfort and trust he had not experienced before. He realized that this was more than just survival. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, connection, and the promise of something greater than himself. The cabin, once quiet and isolated, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and life. The children slept peacefully, dreaming of adventures in the snow and lessons learned from their new friend. The widow rested nearby, aware of the fragility of life but also of its potential for joy and connection. The man, finally feeling a sense of belonging, allowed himself to rest fully, knowing that for the first time in a long while he was safe, cared for, and part of something meaningful. Days passed in the cabin, and a quiet routine settled over the household. The snowstorm had left the mountains coated in thick white, making travel difficult but also creating a world of beauty and stillness outside the windows. The man, now recovered from the immediate danger of the storm, began to help more actively. He cleared paths in the snow, stacked firewood, and tended to the stove with skill that showed years of experience living in harsh conditions. The widow watched him carefully, noting his quiet efficiency and calm strength. There was something reassuring about the way he moved, a sense that he had faced challenges far greater than a simple storm and had survived them. The children, curious and eager, followed him closely, asking questions about everything they saw. They wanted to know how to recognize safe paths in the snow, how to track animals, and how to find shelter if lost. The man answered carefully, teaching them skills that were practical yet filled with wonder. He showed them how to observe the mountains, how to read the clouds, and how to notice small signs that could mean danger was near. The children listened intently, absorbing each lesson as if it were a story filled with excitement. At first, the widow had been cautious, unsure of how this stranger fit into their lives. But as she watched him interact with her children, she saw patience, gentleness, and a protective instinct she had not expected. He laughed with them, helped them when they stumbled in the snow, and corrected mistakes without anger or impatience. There was a rhythm to his actions, a balance of strength and care that made the household feel more secure. Slowly, she began to trust him, to feel that his presence was not just helpful but necessary for the children's safety and happiness. Meals became shared moments of quiet conversation. The man, while reserved, began to talk more, telling small stories of his life in the mountains, of challenges faced and lessons learned. The children asked endless questions, fascinated by his experiences, while the widow listened and sometimes contributed with her own thoughts and knowledge. Together they formed a circle of warmth and connection that the snowstorm outside could not penetrate. The cabin felt alive, filled with laughter, curiosity, and the quiet comfort of companionship. One afternoon, while the snow shimmered outside like a field of diamonds, the man helped the children build a snow shelter. He showed them how to pack the snow to create walls strong enough to withstand the wind, how to create a small roof that would protect from falling snow, and how to make an entrance that kept the warmth inside. The children worked eagerly, learning from his hands-on guidance while the widow watched, feeling pride and relief at the sight of them learning practical skills in safety. She noticed the way the man smiled softly when the children succeeded, the quiet joy in his eyes that reflected a sense of purpose and belonging. As evening fell, the household gathered by the fire. The man shared stories of life in the mountains, speaking of frozen rivers, hidden paths, and the animals that roamed the wilderness. He told tales of survival, of enduring harsh winters, and of finding beauty in the quiet, untouched corners of the world. The children listened in awe, imagining themselves in the scenes he described, and the widow felt a deep appreciation for the perspective he brought. The stories were not just entertaining. They carried lessons about resilience, observation, and respect for nature. The man also began to share small personal details, revealing glimpses of his past. He had traveled alone for years, learning to rely on himself, yet he had never known a family. The widow realized that he had never experienced the warmth and connection that her children brought naturally. She saw the way his eyes softened when he interacted with them, the care he took in answering questions and helping with small tasks. It was clear that he was forming a bond with the children, a bond that went beyond simple friendship and into the beginnings of trust and affection. The children, in turn, began to show him small signs of attachment. They offered him handmade gifts, simple drawings, and small trinkets they had found. He accepted them with gentle thanks, touched by their thoughtfulness. They played games together in the cabin, making up stories and adventures that mixed reality with imagination. The man engaged fully, laughing with them, encouraging their creativity and sometimes joining in their playful mischief. It was a new experience for him, one that brought warmth to his heart in a way that survival alone never had. The widow noticed subtle changes in her own feelings as well. She had been cautious at first, wary of allowing someone into their lives so suddenly. But as days passed, she saw kindness, reliability, and gentleness in him. She observed the way he interacted with her children, the way he helped without being asked, and the small gestures that showed care and consideration. A quiet trust was growing, accompanied by a sense of relief that they were not alone in facing the challenges of the mountains. Night came again, and the family settled into their small routines. The children went to bed, tired from the day's activities, while the widow and the man sat by the fire. They spoke quietly about simple things, plans for the next day, observations of the weather, and small stories from the man's life. The conversation was easy and unforced, and in the warmth of the cabin, a connection grew that neither had anticipated. Outside, the mountains stood silent and majestic, a reminder of the harsh world beyond the cabin walls. Inside there was life, warmth, and the quiet beginnings of a family. The man reflected on the days that had passed, realizing that the children's presence and the widow's care had brought him something he had never expected. He had survived alone for so long, relying on his own skills and instincts, but now he understood the value of connection, trust, and care. For the first time, he felt the possibility of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than himself. Over the next few days, the bond between the man and the children deepened. He taught them how to track small animals, how to find safe paths through the snow, and how to respect the natural world. They learned quickly, eager to imitate him and earn his approval. He encouraged their curiosity, answered questions patiently, and shared his knowledge without condescension. The widow observed with gratitude, seeing the positive influence he had on her children, the confidence and skills they were gaining under his guidance. One afternoon, while the snow glittered in the sunlight, the man and the children went outside to check the condition of the paths near the cabin. He showed them how to test the ice, how to recognize areas that might be dangerous, and how to mark safe routes. The children listened carefully, their trust in him growing with each lesson. They laughed and played as they worked, but they also understood the importance of what they were learning. The man's presence had transformed not only their safety, but also their understanding of the world around them. Back in the cabin, the widow prepared meals intended to daily chores, grateful for the help and companionship of the man. She noticed the way he had become integrated into their routines, quietly assisting with tasks and sharing responsibilities. There was a sense of partnership forming, subtle but undeniable, that brought a new kind of stability and warmth to the household. Evenings continued to be filled with storytelling and shared experiences. The man revealed more about his life, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned from surviving alone. The children listened, wide-eyed and fascinated, while the widow appreciated the depth of his character and the perspective he brought to their lives. The bond between them was growing, a mixture of trust, respect, and a budding affection that neither could yet fully name. Night fell, and the cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. The children slept peacefully, dreaming of adventures in the snow and lessons learned from their new teacher. The widow rested nearby, feeling a sense of relief and cautious hope. The man sat quietly by the hearth, reflecting on the days that had passed and the new life that was forming around him. He had come to the mountains alone, unprepared and vulnerable, and yet he had found warmth, care, and a sense of connection that he had never known. The mountains outside remained vast and imposing, but inside the cabin, a family was quietly coming together. The man realized that what had begun as a rescue had grown into something far more meaningful. He had been saved by this small family, and in return, he had begun to care deeply for them. The children trusted him. The widow relied on him, and together they were creating a life filled with warmth, learning, and quiet happiness. For the first time, he felt that he was not alone, that he could be part of something enduring and real, and that his life had taken a turn he had never imagined but had always secretly hoped for. Weeks passed, and life in the cabin began to settle into a quiet rhythm. The snow outside remained thick and heavy in places, but the storm had long since passed, leaving a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. The man had fully recovered from the snowstorm, and the bond between him, the widow, and her children had deepened. He was no longer a visitor or a guest. He had become part of the household in a way that was natural and unforced. The children grew bolder, exploring the snow-covered woods under his guidance. They learned to recognize animal tracks, to navigate the forest safely, and to anticipate changes in the weather. The man watched them with quiet pride, encouraging them and gently correcting mistakes. He had never known children of his own, but with these two, a new sense of responsibility and care had begun to take root in his heart. The children in turn trusted him completely. They laughed with him, shared their small secrets, and relied on his presence for comfort and guidance. The widow observed these interactions carefully. She had been cautious at first, uncertain about how this man would fit into their lives, but she had seen his patience, his quiet strength, and his unwavering care for her children. Slowly, she felt herself opening to the possibility that this man could remain with them, not just as a helper, but as someone essential to their safety and happiness. She noticed the subtle ways he contributed to their lives, from stacking firewood to helping the children with small tasks, and felt a quiet gratitude that words could not fully express. One morning, the man suggested they take a walk through the forest, just beyond the ridge where the cabin sat. The children were excited, and the widow agreed, wrapping herself in a warm coat and helping them bundle up. The snow was deep, but the sunlight reflected off it, creating a world of sparkling white that felt almost magical. As they walked, he taught them to move quietly, to notice the subtle sounds of the forest, and to appreciate the stillness of nature. The children were fascinated, asking questions at every turn, and he answered patiently, explaining the lessons he had learned over years of living in the mountains. During their walk, they found a small clearing where the snow had melted slightly, revealing patches of earth and small plants struggling to survive. The man explained the importance of respecting nature, showing them how to observe without disturbing, how to understand the balance between living creatures and the environment, and how to find beauty in even the harshest conditions. The children listened intently, absorbing not only the knowledge but also the calm, measured way he spoke. The widow followed behind, watching the interactions with a sense of awe and quiet happiness. She realized that the children were not just learning survival skills. They were learning to appreciate life and the world around them. As the days continued, the man became increasingly integrated into the household. He helped with chores, repaired small things around the cabin, and always made time for the children. He shared stories of his life, tales of survival and endurance, and lessons about perseverance and observation. The children loved listening, and the widow appreciated the wisdom he brought. Their days were filled with activity, learning, and quiet moments of connection that created a sense of security and warmth within the small cabin. One evening, after a day spent building snow shelters and exploring the nearby woods, the family sat around the fire, The children were exhausted but happy, and the widow prepared a simple meal for them all. The man, now comfortable in their presence, shared stories from his past, describing experiences of survival and moments of quiet beauty in the mountains. The children listened wide-eyed, imagining themselves in his stories, and the widow felt a deep sense of connection forming. She realized that this man, once a stranger rescued from a snowstorm, had become someone essential to their lives, someone they relied upon not just for strength and skill, but for companionship and care. As the night wore on, the man and the widow spoke quietly after the children had gone to bed. They discussed simple matters, the state of the cabin, the weather, and small plans for the following day. But there was an undercurrent of something deeper, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them. Both were aware, though neither spoke openly, that their lives had changed in ways they could not yet fully name. They shared a quiet understanding, a trust built on shared experiences and mutual respect, that hinted at the possibilities for the future. The next morning brought another opportunity for exploration. The man and the children ventured further into the forest, discovering a frozen stream and learning to navigate its slippery surface safely. He taught them to move carefully, to test the ice, and to watch for weak spots. The children, confident under his guidance, moved with care and curiosity, asking questions and experimenting with what they had learned. The widow watched from the edge of the clearing, proud of their courage and carefulness, and grateful for the man's steady presence. In the days that followed, the man's connection with the children grew stronger. They played simple games, built structures in the snow, and shared stories by the fire. He taught them practical skills like chopping wood safely, tending small fires, and recognizing edible plants. But beyond the lessons, there was something more profound. He showed them patience, understanding, and quiet encouragement. The children responded with trust and affection, feeling secure in his presence, and the widow noticed a warmth in their interactions that filled her with relief and hope. One afternoon, a challenge presented itself. The wind picked up and snow began to fall once again, though not as violently as before. The children had been playing outside, and the man quickly guided them back to the cabin, showing them how to find safe routes and avoid hidden hazards in the snow. The widow watched as he protected and instructed them, his calm authority providing security. Once inside, they warmed themselves by the fire, and the children shared their excitement about the adventure, while the man smiled, enjoying their energy and curiosity. That evening, the family gathered for a simple meal. The man, now fully comfortable in his new surroundings, helped the widow prepare food, teaching the children small tasks in the process. There was laughter, conversation, and the quiet contentment of a household functioning together. The widow observed the ease with which he moved within their home, the subtle ways he cared for the children, and the patience and respect he showed. She felt a deep appreciation and a growing sense of attachment, though it was quiet and measured, much like the man himself. Over time, it became clear that the man had no intention of leaving soon. He had found a place of warmth, connection, and purpose, and the family had accepted him fully. They worked together, explored together, and shared stories and lessons. The children who had once been wary now called him friend, guide, and protector. The widow, who had initially hesitated, now felt a quiet certainty that this man was becoming an essential part of their lives. One particularly cold evening, the man sat by the fire reflecting on the weeks that had passed. He had come into their lives unexpectedly, rescued from the snowstorm, and yet he had found something far more valuable than survival. He had found connection, trust, and the beginnings of a family. The children's laughter, their curiosity, and their warmth had softened a part of him that had been hardened by years of isolation. The widow's quiet strength, care, and trust had created a foundation for something lasting. He realized that he was no longer just a visitor. He had become part of their lives in a profound way. The mountains outside remained vast and imposing, a reminder of the harshness of the world beyond the cabin walls. But inside, life had taken on a new rhythm. There was warmth, laughter, learning, and care. The bond between the man, the widow, and her children had deepened, creating a sense of family that was built on trust, kindness, and shared experience. They had survived a snowstorm together, and in doing so, had discovered something more important than survival: belonging, connection, and the quiet promise of a future they could face together. The winter slowly began to lose its harshness, though the mountains remained blanketed in snow. The man had settled fully into the rhythm of the household. The children now considered him part of their family, and the widow felt a quiet certainty that he was someone she could trust, someone who had become essential in their lives. They had all faced the storm together, and it had created a bond that was unspoken but deeply felt. One crisp morning, the man woke before the children. He looked out the window at the soft light illuminating the snow-covered peaks and felt a deep sense of belonging. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the urge to wander alone. He realized that the cabin, the widow, and her children had become more than shelter and kindness. They were home. He quietly moved about, preparing the fire and some breakfast, knowing the children would soon wake and the widow would join him in the kitchen. The children came down the stairs laughing and talking, eager to show him a small snow fort they had built outside. He followed them, careful with each step in the icy snow, and watched with pride as they played. He helped reinforce the fort walls and taught them a few clever tricks for snow construction. The children were thrilled to see their small efforts improved, and their laughter filled the mountains in a way that seemed to push the last remnants of winter gloom away. As the day progressed, the family moved seamlessly through daily chores. The man chopped wood, the children helped carry smaller pieces inside, and the widow prepared meals and tidied the cabin. Their interactions were easy, natural, and filled with a warmth that had grown over weeks. It was clear that this man, who had been rescued by the children from the storm, was no longer an outsider. He had become their protector, teacher, and guide. The children's eyes lit up when he smiled, their laughter rising above the crackle of the fire, and the widow felt an overwhelming sense of peace she hadn't known for years. Afternoons were often spent exploring the surroundings. The man taught the children how to find hidden paths in the snow, how to notice subtle changes in the weather, and how to move quietly through the forest. They found animal tracks and discussed which animals might have left them, learning about life in the mountains. The children were curious and fearless under his watchful eye, confident that he would guide and protect them. The widow followed behind, keeping a careful watch while observing how much the man had become a part of their daily lives. Evenings were reserved for storytelling. The man shared tales from his life, not only survival stories but also small moments of quiet beauty he had witnessed while living alone in the mountains. He described frozen waterfalls sparkling in the sunlight, hidden groves of trees untouched by humans, and the simple satisfaction of a warm fire after a long, cold day. The children were captivated, imagining themselves in those scenes, while the widow listened with a sense of wonder and appreciation for the depth of the man's experiences. Over time, a deeper connection began to grow. The widow noticed it first in small gestures, the way the man would gently brush snow from the children's coats, the way he offered her a steadying hand when carrying heavy wood, and the quiet attention he gave to their needs without being asked. It was subtle, but she could feel the care and respect he had for her and her family. She began to see him as more than a friend or a protector. He had become a presence she could rely on, someone whose place in their lives felt permanent. One particularly cold night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the children were restless from being inside. The man suggested building an indoor obstacle course using furniture and blankets, turning the cabin into a small adventure zone. The children squealed with delight, racing and crawling, while the widow joined in, laughing at their antics. In those moments, the cabin felt alive with joy and warmth, a sharp contrast to the harshness of the mountains outside. The man watched the family, a quiet smile on his face, realizing that these small moments of happiness were more important than anything he had known in his solitary life. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them continued to grow. The children's trust in him was absolute. They ran to him with excitement, sought his guidance in every small adventure, and shared their thoughts and feelings freely. The widow relied on him not only for physical help but also for emotional support, finding comfort in his calm presence and quiet strength. The household had transformed into a true family, where care, trust, and affection were freely given and received. One afternoon, the family decided to venture further into the forest than before. They followed a winding path that led to a small frozen pond. The man taught the children how to test the ice, move cautiously, and recognize signs of danger. They laughed and played on the ice, feeling a sense of freedom and excitement. The widow watched them, feeling gratitude for the man's guidance and protection. She realized that this family, formed under extraordinary circumstances, had created a safe and joyful space in the midst of the mountain's harsh beauty. As evening fell, the family returned to the cabin, tired but happy. The man helped with dinner. The children set the table and the widow moved quietly around the kitchen. They shared their stories from the day, laughing and reflecting on their adventures. The man listened, offering encouragement and gentle corrections when needed. The children's eyes shone with admiration and love, and the widow felt a deep sense of contentment. She realized that the man, once a stranger, had become a constant in their lives, a presence they all depended on and cherished. The snow continued to fall gently outside, creating a soft blanket over the mountains. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of family life. The man reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from being lost and vulnerable in a snowstorm to being a part of something meaningful. He realized that the children and their mother had given him more than shelter. They had given him a place to belong, a sense of purpose, and the warmth of human connection. Night fell, and the family gathered by the fire. The children snuggled close, exhausted from the day's adventures, while the widow and the man shared quiet conversation. They discussed small plans for the following days, the state of the cabin, and observations of the mountains. There was an unspoken understanding between the man and the widow, a recognition that their lives had changed in profound ways. They were no longer simply two adults caring for children. They were a family, bound together by trust, care, and shared experiences. Over the following weeks, life continued in this rhythm of warmth, learning, and companionship. The children thrived under the man's guidance, learning skills, gaining confidence, and growing in joy and curiosity. The widow felt secure and supported, grateful for his presence and the stability he brought. The man, once a lone wanderer, realized that he had found something he had never known: love, trust, and belonging. One quiet morning, as the sun reflected off the snow-covered peaks, the man watched the children play and the widow move about the cabin. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had brought him here. The snowstorm, which had seemed like a curse at the time, had led him to this family, to a home, and to a place where he could finally rest, contribute, and be loved. The widow, noticing his contemplative expression, smiled softly, feeling the same gratitude and recognition of the bond that had grown between them. As the days went on, the man's role in the household became undeniable. He was protector, teacher, companion, and increasingly the father figure the children had longed for without realizing it. The household was no longer just a refuge from the mountain's harshness. It was a home filled with laughter, care, learning, and love. The children, who had once feared being alone or losing the only parent they had left, now had someone to guide them, play with them, and protect them in ways that were steady and reliable. Evenings remained a time for sharing stories, teaching lessons, and reflecting on the day. The man told tales of his own childhood, of winters survived and challenges overcome, always emphasizing the importance of courage, observation, and care. The children listened with wide eyes, asking questions and imagining themselves in the scenes he described. The widow watched, seeing the positive impact of his presence on their growth, confidence, and happiness. As night settled over the mountains, the family gathered around the fire, feeling warmth and security that had grown over weeks of shared experiences. The man looked at the widow and the children, recognizing the depth of the connection that had formed. He realized that what had begun as a rescue from a snowstorm had blossomed into a true family, built on trust, care, and the shared experience of overcoming hardship. The snow outside continued to fall gently, creating a peaceful landscape. But inside the cabin, the warmth, laughter, and love of the family thrived. The man had found his place, the children had found a protector and guide, and the widow had found support and partnership. Together, they had turned what had begun as a moment of desperation into a life filled with hope, connection, and the quiet promise of a future faced together. The story that began with a snowstorm had ended with the creation of a family, one forged by courage, kindness, and the bonds of the heart.